He watched her sleep the way men who have taught themselves to command silence watch for thunder, attentive, patient, prepared for the impossible crack. It was 3 in the morning in a room that did not belong to any particular hour. A bank of screens threw blue light over Bramwell Rossi's face, the marble of the console catching pinpricks of reflected glass like a constellation collapsed into a desk. On one monitor, Addie's room was washed in the dim halo of a nightlight shaped like a small bear. On another, the playroom lay empty and expectant, toys arranged as if someone might at any moment decide to make it mess. Somewhere in the house a motor hummed, the refrigerator, a pump for a support cushion, but the house felt suspended, waiting for movement to resume the rhythms it refused to outgrow. He had built the house as he built everything else, as a set of answers. Threats, the kind that arrive over the phone and in whispered maps on the other side of town, could be met with guards, with men and money, and layers of distance. But the thing that kept him up was not the threat of an enemy in a car outside. It was the possibility of a failure inside the walls he controlled. Caregivers who arrived polite and professional left within weeks. Difficulties with patience, boundaries, 1,000 small misreads of a child whose body did not speak in predictable ways. Each departure felt to him like another crack in a system that had to remain sealed, which is how the cameras came to be. Not a paranoiac's indulgence, but a logistical measure. They were meant to watch, to document, to act as witness if something went wrong. They were meant to be proof that care had been given and harm prevented. On the monitors, Bramwell could fast forward and freeze and slow time until the most minor expression looked like an event. He watched hands, the tiniest things. Addie's right thumb curled around an empty air, the way a vine might seek a trellis. A knuckle twitched in sleep. He watched flashes of memory on loop, previous caregivers smiling too brightly while Addie stared, eyes small and measured as the sea. He watched himself in the footage as well. The man who stepped out once a day to check a feeding, whose hand lingered too long on a shoulder, who had come to equate presence with protection. There were nights when the screens comforted him. Seeing a caregiver enter at 8 in the morning was reassurance. Seeing Addie laugh in the playroom with someone else felt like evidence that his decisions had been right. There were other nights when the cameras were a glass coffin. The feeds had a way of bearing him to himself. He could watch how his gaze hardened when the wrong person made a joke at the wrong time, how his jaw set when a helper asked for rules that cut too close to the control he hoarded. The surveillance was protection shaped like a prism. It split the world into angles he could manage, but it also refracted his loneliness into an array of small obsessions. Cassidy McKenna arrived on a gray afternoon in late November, when the light was already drained to the color of old coins. Bramwell had approved 4 candidates that week without looking closely. The cost of hiring had felt like the cost of admitting failure. Cassidy's resume was tidy, the kind of paper narrative that could fit into a manila folder and be filed away. Training in physical therapy, a warm reference from a pediatric center downtown, an unusual fluency in languages. Italian, she said, for lullabies perhaps. What set her apart, unexpectedly, was not what she had written, but what she insisted upon in the phone call. She wanted to meet Addie before being hired. That was not protocol. It was not usual. Bramwell remembered the voice on the other end as steady, not pleading, simply certain. "Permission first," she said when she introduced herself, unfolding like someone who knew there could be no substitute for regard. In the foyer, Bramwell watched her from the doorway, an observer who recognized caution as its own form of armor. She carried a small satchel. She did not glare at the house or flinch at its silence. She knelt when she first met Addie, lowering herself in a motion that was not theatrical but practical. Her eyes leveled with his daughter's. She spoke slowly. She asked whether she could touch Addie's hand. Bramwell, watching now without the distance of glass between him and his daughter, felt a small disconcerting relief at the way his daughter's face softened in response. Addie's smile was a quiet thing, creases at the corners of her eyes more expressive than any adult's speech. Cassidy read the small gestures permitted to a child in a body that had been made private by injury. She called for permission. She used her voice like a tool, soft and firm in equal measure. Her hands moved across Addie's forearm in slow, measured circles. She spoke in Italian that was less polished than it was musical, phrases that held lullaby rhythms rather than strict translation. There was no contrivance in her touch. She asked about the scar at Addie's shoulder, about the way she preferred to sleep, about her favorite song. Bramwell found himself, almost against his will, watching the screens for that small, almost indecipherable sign he had waited for. The child's respirations deepening, the eyelids lifting just enough for a new look to arrive. He hired her the same afternoon. The early days were a study in small miracles that could be explained and were therefore permitted. Cassidy's methods were simple, tactile things. Tactile rhythms to encourage slight movements, chest massage for circulation, story fragments in Italian that she braided into play, and songs that were not for healing but for presence. She taught Addie how to use rhythm, the drum of 2 hands on a foam cushion, the pull of a textured board, to translate intention into small progress. Under Cassidy's hands, Addie began to make tiny, verifiable changes, a reach that lasted a second longer, a shift in weight that allowed a new angle of play, a laugh that arrived for no reason other than shared attention. On his monitors, Bramwell watched tenderness the way a man watches a storm. There was the practical part of him, notes, charts, measurable therapy. There was also the other part, the private man who had learned to think of necessity as a ledger. He felt gratitude and an unfamiliar, dangerous tenderness. He found himself watching Cassidy at odd hours. The monitors could show the minutiae that built into trust. How she moved a sock over Addie's foot with reverence. How she hummed the same Italian refrain that, unbearably, made him think of his own mother. The cameras turned her into a series of frames, each one carved out of time. Even as he watched, suspicion crept in like a cold under the door. He had never trusted gifts that felt too immediate. Men who rose by force came to expect treachery in others. It is a corrosive logic. Cassidy's insistence on meeting Addie, her steady gaze in the foyer, her small rituals, these were all reasons to check. Bramwell's organization had taught him to follow threads until they terminated where he could see them. For a man like him, trust came with a map. He found an edge to worry in something that might have been nothing. On a late-night playback, Cassidy finishing a session and dusting her hands, Bramwell froze a frame and noticed the corner of a photograph peeking from the satchel she dropped by the chair. It was a single crumpled print, half hidden under a packet of tissues. He could not tell much from the grain, but he recognized the curve of a face, a streetlight, a smudge that could have been a district mark on an old police blotter. He enlarged the frame the way one might magnify a stain in a shirt to see whether it was blood or rust. The picture resolved into a young man with a slow smile and a bandage at his temple. On the back, in the brief seconds the camera caught it as Cassidy fumbled through the bag, there was writing, an address or a name. Bramwell paused the feed so long the room felt like a held breath. The name, when he ran it through the private files he kept separate from the supervisory web, matched a report from a year earlier. A violent altercation in the Eastern District. One young man left with life forever rearranged. Marcus Webb's file was clinical and blunt the way hospital reports can be. Dates, diagnoses, the dull facts of injury and therapy. There was no suggestion in those documents of intent tied to Bramwell's name. But the Eastern District was the map of the property his people had fought over. The possibility of connection sat in his chest like a stone. Cassidy, meanwhile, did not live inside the monitors. The camera feeds could show the mechanics of her work, but not the reasons that threaded through it. Her interior life, what she wrote in the journal she kept folded inside her satchel, was different. When she closed the front door to the house at night, she did not immediately go home. She would sit in her car with the engine off, let her breath settle into the space the way someone who had been holding their breath does before they speak. The journal entries she made later were sparse and precise. Dates, small assessments of Addie's responsiveness, lists of exercises performed, and then, tucked beneath the pragmatic notes, handwriting that changed tone. A name, the word sometimes, the length of a silence. Marcus, when she wrote of him, came through as a living break in a life that had been otherwise practical. He was not a symbol in her entries. He was a mouthful of stubborn sound, a laugh that had once carried down a hallway before the world closed around it. There were days, weeks sometimes, when Cassidy's grief made itself heavy at the base of her skull. She did not pretend to forgive the man who could have been an enemy for the system that flattened them both into numbers. That was not how she wrote. Her journal allowed contradictions. She could love from the grief and hate from the hurt, and still walk into Addie's room the next morning with the same steady calm. Cassidy's life before joining Bramwell's household had been built on small economies of care. She had worked at a clinic where therapy meant sticking to protocols and saving what could be saved. She had learned to improvise when the budgets ran thin, craft materials repurposed as therapeutic tools, songs learned from women who had been raising children across decades. She carried Italian lullabies learned from an old neighbor who had immigrated and never lost the cadence of her mother tongue. She used those songs not as nostalgia but as a way to make rhythm into medicine. No miracles promised, only the kind of soft, repeated contact that can coax a body into remembering how to move in the margins it still controls. When she first met Addie, she noticed how still the child held herself, an armor of sparing movement. So Cassidy began with permission. She named each touch. "Can I try a circle?" she would ask, waiting for the faint nod or a blink. "Is this okay?" It took 3 days before Addie allowed a hand to rest against Cassidy's palm, long enough for the caregiver to register warmth. On the 7th day, Addie offered a toy to Cassidy, as if bestowing a trust. Bramwell watched the exchange in a sequence that felt like a private theft. From the corridors where monitors were mounted, it was easy to make motive into intention. The world Bramwell had learned the contours of, one in which moves are calculated and loyalties measured, saw Cassidy's actions as potentially strategic. She could be inside the house with a photograph in her bag because she needed leverage. She could be there because she saw an opening. Bramwell had been part of many stories in which the man at the top maintained distance by not asking the small questions. He had never been inside a life that required answering small questions all day. The photograph became a focal point. Bramwell traced the file lines, the reports, the address, until familiarity made him dangerous with computation. In the same way that he could map territories on a board, he began to map Cassidy's possible routes. He checked for patterns, visits to certain clinics, a surname that might appear on charity rolls, a note in a ledger that hinted at a donation to a rehabilitation center in the Eastern District. Each match was a partial picture, none of them spelled out an obvious intent. But his monitors allowed him to be patient in a way the world outside did not allow. A man who could wait and wait for a small movement to betray itself. Cassidy, watching him through the edge of her days, never had reason to suspect the full architecture of his suspicion. She noticed, vaguely, the way the house became quieter after she had been there a month. Doors that once opened at noon were left closed. Men who once greeted her with easy questions offered only curt nods. Bramwell stopped coming to the playroom in the afternoons, though he still hovered in the footage, as if unable to keep his feet from the doorway. When he was in the house, his presence was less intrusive physically than it had been. It became a shape on the periphery, a hand on a banister seen only in replay. At night, when the house was reduced to breathing, and the low hum of systems that were not meant to be human, she would take out the journal and write in a hand that both steadied her and betrayed her fatigue. She wrote not to be dramatic. Her entries were not performance, but to leave a trail for herself, a paper conversation with the life she refused to let be consumed by a single act. She wrote of Addie's small wins and the exact cadence of Italian phrases that seemed to soften scars just enough to coax a response. La luna guarda, she had written once under the date. The moon watches. She passed the phrase from an old woman who used it as a blessing. She used it as a benediction to the small work she did, be a witness. On a Tuesday evening 3 weeks into Cassidy's employment, the house performed one of its little betrayals. The security feed captured a moment that was not meant for anyone's eyes and threaded it like a needle through Bramwell's chest. It was late. Addie had fallen asleep on Cassidy's shoulder in the living room, a thin blanket over her legs. Cassidy's head rested against the child's, and for the length of that frame she did not move at all. In the corner of the camera's view, a small photograph dangled from Cassidy's satchel. Just the corner, just the color of a jacket Marcus might have worn. She reached slowly into her bag, withdrew the photo, and for a negligible moment the camera caught her thumb tracing the edge of the picture as if remembering the contour of a face. Bramwell paused the footage and sat back from the console. The monitors turned his face into a map of the man he had been. He told himself that his job required diligence. He told himself that the cameras were a record, not a verdict. Yet the sight of Cassidy's thumb, an intimate motion made brief and public, stole something from him he had not known he kept, a desire to protect that was both familial and territorial. He imagined hypotheticals that could be written from the edges he observed, that the photograph belonged to a man who blamed Bramwell, that Cassidy's presence was a modest revenge, that the child she cradled was a wedge into his fortress. He could have summoned Cassidy to the study then, asked questions in a room where the marble would render his voice thin and formal. He could have called for her file and planted men like stakes in the garden to see whether she would move. Instead, he watched. Watching had been his refuge. It was also, he was beginning to understand in the thin hours between night and the approaching light, his cage. There were other scenes on the feeds that complicated his suspicions. He watched Cassidy teaching Addie how to spread a colored scarf across her lap and tap in time with the beat of Cassidy's palm. He watched the child make a sound, half laugh, half puff, that arrived like weather. He watched as Cassidy cleaned a smudge from Addie's nose and then, without ceremony, put the smudge into her own palm as if to carry it away. In one night frame, he watched Cassidy sit at the piano and play a hesitant melody in an old, warm key while Addie slept. And Bramwell felt, in the way of watching, something like shame. It was not shame for himself, necessarily. He had spent his life reconciling himself to things that required a hard hand. But shame that his instruments of protection had been unable to make the small necessary thing. A place where a child could feel simply, wholly, like a child. The house had been designed to impress. Marble, long mirrors, a stairwell that arced like a memory. Things that say to the world the kind of man who built them. But the cameras made the house strange. In one clipped playback, Bramwell found himself watching the stairwell as if it were a stage. Cassidy walked up the stairs with a laundry basket, her silhouette a careful domestic shape against the long run of steps. Addie, propped against a cushion on a landing, waved a small toy at her. Cassidy paused, sat on the step below, and coaxed Addie's hand. The gesture was precise and private, and not meant to be adjudicated by anyone. Bramwell muted the feed and sat in a silence that felt like a verdict. His suspicion did not announce itself as a plan. It arrived as a series of small choices. He wrote a note in a private ledger, an old habit, and had one of his administrative people run a discreet check. The result came back like a splinter of information, a file that matched the young man in the photograph, a clinic name in the Eastern District, a mention of a crossfire that had hit an apartment block a year earlier. There was no connection spelled out with clear lines, no evidence of a conspiracy, only the sloppy human aftermath of a city where combat lines blurred into neighborhoods and people like Marcus got caught in collapsing places. That evening he watched a different scene on the monitors. Cassidy packing a small bag, folding a spare scarf into a pocket as if preparing to leave before she had, and then sitting for a long time, hands flat on her knees. She took out the photograph, smoothed it, and tucked it inside the journal she carried. For a moment she looked up, not at the camera. No one ever looked at the cameras. It was like looking at a non-existent god, but out the window toward the faint lights of the city. Bramwell leaned forward, feeling the long distance between the cameras and the life they recorded. "You asked for permission," he said to himself, a remark he could not easily place. It was true. She had asked. Permission had been her first move, and then her labor had become a series of small, consistent asking motions. Can I? May I? Is this okay? Bramwell realized in his quiet room that no one had ever asked him those things. He had been asked for what he could give and had rarely been asked to give differently. Cassidy's motives remained, to him, an unsolved riddle. The photograph suggested personal history. The journal suggested grief. The work she did suggested an ethic. None of these things, on their own, justified suspicion. Yet for Bramwell, suspicion was not an end. It was a method. He began to watch differently. He started to play the feeds in fragments, to slow the intervals, to let the minutes between scenes become heavy enough to carry implication. He watched Cassidy at odd hours. The early morning shift when Addie woke with a start. The late-night feed when Cassidy sat in the dark and hummed the Italian lullaby into the sterile quiet of the house. He watched the way she closed the door to the laundry room and leaned her head back against the wood like a prayer. Cassidy wrote in her journal, small factual notes, and beneath them, lines that read like sutures for a heart too raw for grand gestures. She had been the sister who stayed when mates scattered. Marcus had been her only brother. The city had taught them both endurance and the terrible economy of making do. She had never vowed revenge in the way stories render vengeance. She had always preferred practical protocols. Help the one you can. Keep the one you love from further breakage. Yet the photograph of Marcus with the bandage at his temple clung to her like a ghost. She had come to Bramwell's house for a job, and she had come for other reasons she mostly did not name aloud. The two motives could live in the same body without dissolving one another. She could want to protect Addie while also arranging redress for Marcus, whatever form that redress might take. There is a certain cruelty in houses like Bramwell's. They promise to shield the inside from the outside, and in doing so they make both the inside and the person within feel like property. Bramwell believed himself a keeper of things that should not be touched. Cassidy believed in the sanctity of touch itself. That distinction between custody and contact became the tension of their early days together. On a rain-splattered morning, 3 weeks after Cassidy was hired, Bramwell watched her take Addie outside under a navy umbrella, the child's small legs tucked into a stroller, while Cassidy pushed the wheel over slick cobblestones. It was a rare exposure of the body to weather. Bramwell's men seldom allowed the child into the elements unless a physician required it. He watched the scene unfold with the impatience of someone who had grown up measuring risk in tables. A neighbor passed by and nodded at Cassidy. A dog barked in the distance. Addie reached with a slow, sure motion toward a falling leaf. Cassidy plucked it up and placed it in the child's palm like a gift that explained the world. Bramwell cleared his throat in the dark and realized the sound startled him more than he expected. The camera could not show the way his throat tightened when he watched Addie discover a leaf. He found himself uncomfortable, a little ashamed, allowing for the possibility that cameras could fail at something essential. They could show small facts, but not the way a hand teaches a body that the world is safe enough to touch. He could not say when suspicion hardened into intention. It was a slow accretion of small choices. But by the time the photograph had become a visible thing on his screen, a recognized face, his fingers began to drift across his private ledger of weights and measures. He had colleagues who would roll their eyes at the idea of emotion in an executive's life. For Bramwell, emotions were not contrary to the ledger. They required their own accounting. He counted gratitude and he counted danger, and when the balance tipped toward the latter, he felt a kinetic pull in his body, a need to know that smelled like hunger in a man who had grown up learning that information was power. That evening, when the house had the soft hush of people eating alone, and the monitors hummed with 1,000 small slices of domestic life, Cassidy sat on Addie's bedroom rug and turned the photographs over one by one. Bramwell watched through night vision as she smoothed each image and whispered names under her breath. In the low light, she held one up against the window, the city beyond a scatter of cold stars. Bramwell watched her do this with the kind of attention he had given to building walls and installing cameras. He was learning to read reverence as a function of devotion rather than as a strategy of manipulation. When she finally left the room, she placed the journal in her satchel, zipped it shut, and for a heartbeat, her thumb stroked the spine, a private gesture that made Bramwell's chest contract in an unfamiliar way. The tape of footage rolled back on itself like an ocean wave rehearsing its motion. Bramwell paused and replayed the small hand motion until the image blurred into something softer than suspicion. A man recognizing at last that he had been watching life from the wrong side of the glass. The ledger, however, did not erase itself. He could feel, beneath the new tenderness, something else awakening, a territorial instinct that had built him into being. The Eastern District file lingered like a shadow on the margin. There were men in the city who would say that collateral damage is a cost of doing business. Bramwell had always hated those words because he understood how casual they were. He had tried, in his own way, to make the costs calculable. Now the calculus returned to bite. The thought of Marcus Webb at the center of Cassidy's concern made the house tighten around him. He could have confronted her with a question that evening. He could have gone down the stairs with a file in hand, and a manner that would allow her the decency of answering. He did not. Instead, he turned from the monitors and let the city breathe through the thick panes of glass, as if it might cleanse the alarm set in his bones. Outside, 3 blocks away in a facility that smelled like antiseptic and hope, Marcus Webb learned to fold his hands again, to look up as if the world was no longer an ambush. The photograph that had slipped from Cassidy's satchel to a cameraman's eye was a small piece of his life, a smile wrenched sideways by pain and time. He did not know that evening the shape of the house where his sister worked, or the man who watched her hands move like a clock. He knew only the patient difficulty of learning to use a spoon again, the shiver of frustration at small failure, and the quiet thrill of a new movement. Bramwell sat in the blue wash of his security room and watched footage of a child and a caregiver shaped into a quiet domestic industry of repair. He felt the incalculable distance between what his cameras could record and what a life could hold. The ledger in his head demanded answers he was not sure he wanted. He rewound and watched Cassidy's thumb once more as it smoothed the photograph, a small motion that suggested memory and perhaps motive. He set his jaw, a man whose inclinations had long been to order the world into neat compartments, and he decided to look closer. He set the screens to play slow, letting the minutes stretch until the house felt like it belonged to someone else. Outside the mansion, outside the frame, the city kept happening. Rain on asphalt, a woman arguing at a bus stop, a single light switching off in an apartment block. Inside, the house was full of little sounds. Addie's breathing, a kettle starting in the kitchen, the creak of a step as a guard made his slow rounds. On the monitor, Cassidy hummed, her voice soft and private, an Italian line folded into the hush. Bramwell stayed until dawn, until the monitors began to lose their dark clarity and the world recolored itself into morning. He left his chair with a ledger that had been quietly rearranged into a question, and he did not yet know whether the question would make him kinder or more cruel. He sat with the footage until the light in the monitors began to thin, until the images themselves felt worn from being looked at too long. He could make a case for gathering information. That was what men like him did. But information, when it became an industry, had a way of separating a man from the thing he wanted to hold: his daughter. Bramwell told himself he would follow the thread, quietly, as a ledger entry until he understood whether Cassidy was a kindness with a past or something more calculated. He dispatched a request through the household's small bureaucratic arteries, a discreet background sweep, a tale on the woman who held his child. The request had the phrasing of routine. The request carried the weight of something else. Cassidy kept coming to work as she always did. She arrived in the low light at the kitchen door, hands warm from the walk, carrying a thermos and a small canvas bag of things she said Addie liked. She treated the house like a patient to be tended, not a prize to be inspected. When she moved through rooms, she left lines of presents: sock on the lamp switch off, a toy out where it fell, a towel unfolded over a banister, little imprints of care that, in other houses, men might have considered disorder. In Bramwell's it was an anomaly. The house expected presentation. Cassidy gave it life. The surveillance Bramwell ordered did what surveillance always does. It collected proof and it made stories out of absence. Tailors reported where Cassidy went on days off. Small errands, a clinic in the Eastern District, a cafe with chipped tiles where the barista knew her order. A courier, paid to follow and photograph, supplied 3 images in a sealed envelope. Cassidy at the entrance of a rehabilitation facility. Cassidy sitting by a bench with her satchel open and a small notebook visible. Cassidy looking through a window at a therapy room where a man with a slouching smile practiced putting pegs into a board. The last photograph was the clearest. A man with a bandage near his temple, his jaw a map of recovery, looking directly at the camera in a way that was less defiant than wary. The envelope arrived with the neat tragedy of bureaucracy. The photos taped and labeled, timestamps in the corner like the state's attempt to make chance into evidence. Bramwell unfolded the images in his study, marble a cold counterpoint to the heat rising in his chest, and saw what he already feared. The man in the photograph matched the face on the print Cassidy had tucked into her satchel: Marcus Webb. He was careful in how he let himself feel the recognition. He could write off the connection as coincidence. A city full of lives sometimes made knotted stories without a single line of intent. He could make the practical move and monitor more closely. He could order a call to a lawyer and lay down a plan of retribution if the evidence suggested betrayal. But there was a clause in his chest, an old inconvenient fact that softened him when he held Addie and looked into her unguarded face. If Marcus's wounds were a consequence of the fights his organization had been part of, then the ledger had to account for that too. He asked for Cassidy's satchel to be examined. The request was small, oddly domestic, and it exposed him to the same embarrassment he had avoided for years. A father asking for proof that a woman who touched his child did so without ulterior motive. The satchel produced pages, notes, receipts, a folded program from a small fundraiser in the Eastern District, and, on the very bottom, the journal she kept. It was an old notebook with a soft cover that had been taped at the spine. The label on the inside was written in a slanting hand. "Case notes," she had written. Bramwell did not need to be told that he was about to read someone else's grief to know he shouldn't. But the question of motive had become a matter of custody in his mind. He read. Cassidy's writing in the journal moved like the quiet she used in Addie's room. Precise, occasionally musical, occasionally raw. There were charts, sets of repetitions, little victories noted with a vertical line and a dot. But there were also paragraphs that read like letters to a self who needed reminding. "Marcus," one entry began. "He laughed at the joke about the neon sign on Main. He does not remember why he was there the night the glass broke. He remembers the smell of smoke. I remember his hands." Another line, written on a tear-stained page, said, simply, "Forgiveness is not a thing to gift. It is a table to sit at." There were interventions listed. A school that offered vocational skills, a therapist who specialized in neuro-rehab, the name of a man who refitted crutches. What struck Bramwell was not the accusation he expected, but a steady hand practicing a kindness that had edges. The journal contained not a plan to use his daughter, but a ledger of ways to restore one life to the world. There were also passages that admitted to complicated motives, lines that said she had come to the house for a job and also come with an envelope of hope that something could be set right. She had, in the private leaves, given herself permission to hold both truths without choosing between them. He closed the book and sat with his own ledger, the organization's costs and the city's casualties. The photograph of Marcus felt less like evidence of a plot than an invitation to answer a table that had been ignored. Bramwell, who had ordered cost studies and risk analysis his whole adult life, found the rawness of the journal destabilizing. He did not love it because it judged him. He loved it because it looked like an answer to a question he had not allowed himself to ask. What happens to those our fights touch? In the days that followed, the house narrowed and expanded at once. Bramwell watched the feeds the way a man watches for weather, expectant, prepared. He stepped into the playroom now and then, more often than before, letting his presence be an interruption rather than a check. He discovered that being present in a room where love was given and received was a different discipline than managing logistics. It required waiting, not ordering. It required endurance, not tactics. Cassidy was unaware, in the immediacy of her days, of how fully she occupied his attention. She continued her work with an economy of gestures that made herself sparse, but not absent. She kept the boundaries Bramwell had not expected to see. After a session, she left Addie with a story half told and sat in the kitchen making a list of exercises for the next day. She kept copies of notes in the satchel and gave Bramwell printed summaries when he asked, which she did with an even-handedness that never felt like capitulation. She expected her labor to be evaluated by outcomes. She expected the child's dignity to be the first criterion. She did not expect to be read by a ledger. There were small moments when Bramwell misread tenderness for a threat. Once, in a slow afternoon, he watched a playback of Cassidy teaching Addie to catch a fluttering paper bird. Addie reached with a precision that had been coached for days. Cassidy's hands floated near the movement as if to shape the air. The replay showed Bramwell's reflection in a window behind them, a pale ghost observing the action. He felt anger, stupid, old anger like a reflex, at the idea someone might use his daughter to punish him. He imagined the neighborhood map, names of places where people had been hurt, and he felt protective in a way he had spent his life calling stewardship. But the journal had softened the lines. The photos had made it impossible to ignore that a life had been twisted in the city he controlled. Bramwell's hostility became a calculus. He could remove the risk by firing Cassidy and hiring someone more disposable. He could insist on security protocols that fenced affection from intimacy. Or he could face the cost of his world. The decision sat heavy because it was less about the house than about what he wanted himself to be inside it. The escalation came, unglamorous and sudden, on a rain-lashed afternoon when Addie, tired and overstimulated by a new exercise, began to cry in a way that went through her small body like a current. Cassidy, who had been sitting on the stairwell with a basket of laundry, scooped her up with practiced calm and began to hum the Italian lullaby in a lower register. Addie's cry intensified, the kind of terrified small sound that broke through training. Bramwell, watching through the monitor, felt a throttle of fear he could not quantify. He moved from the security room without thinking the way men always told themselves they did not, impulsively. He reached the stairwell at the same time Cassidy did. She held Addie in one arm. The child's small fist clung to Cassidy's sweater. Bramwell was at the top of the stairs before the argument could shape itself. His hand landed on the banister. His breath changed the way it always had before conflict. "You need to put her down," he said too sharply, a command that had nothing to do with caregiving and everything to do with territory. Cassidy turned, eyes rimmed red, and for a moment Bramwell saw the fatigue under her skin like an ache. "She's scared," she said. "She needs to be soothed, Mr. Rossi. She trusts me." "She's my daughter," he said, the words an old armor. "I know what she needs." "You know numbers," Cassidy replied, her voice steady despite the tremor. "I know how to get her hand to hold a paintbrush again. You've watched me do that. Why is it harder to trust someone than it is to watch them?" He heard the accusation before he thought to answer. It landed like a small, precise blow, an observation rather than an imputation, but it unsettled him more than any threat had. Addie's whimpers hollowed the space between them. Cassidy's free hand cradled the child's head in a way that was careful and unself-conscious. Bramwell felt emotion in him he had not wanted, toward distance, toward the ledger, toward calculation. His instinct was to move Cassidy aside, to withdraw the child into the privacy of a man's control. Instead, he stepped back, not because he had decided to be magnanimous, but because the sight of his daughter held so much tenderness in it that he could no longer translate everything into defense. The step back was a concession and also a revelation. He had been protecting his daughter from a world he had a hand in shaping. Standing there, watching her trust someone else, he could see that protection had become a kind of imprisonment. The child needed someone who would teach her the world was safe to touch, and he had been teaching her safety through surveillance. Cassidy did not kneel to him in gratitude. She met his gaze, and there was in it an exactness that was not soft and was not cruel. "You can watch us," she said simply, "or you can be with us." They both understood what she meant. For Bramwell, being with them would require a change that frightened him because it suggested vulnerability. For Cassidy, being with them meant the possibility of real labor toward repair, not the theater of generosity. There was, in the pause that followed, the sense that the house had shifted on some hidden axis. The confrontation could have ended with a dismissal. Bramwell could have sent Cassidy away that afternoon, citing protocol or a breach. He did not. He walked beside her down the stairs, his steps measured, and for the first time in months he allowed the house to be less a demonstration of power and more a place where things could be undone. That evening, they met in his office. The room had the usual trappings: books that were never read by visitors, an antique desk, photographs of agreements signed with men whose faces blurred with time. But tonight, the air between them was a different measure. Bramwell sat behind the desk and looked at Cassidy as if at a problem he had to solve by other means. "You came for a job," he began, fingers steepled. "You came with a past. I found your photographs." Cassidy did not flinch. She had expected this moment. "I came to work," she said. "I came because I needed the hours, and I came because there's a man who needs something I can help him get back. I did not come to use your child. I came to help her." "You asking for Marcus," Bramwell said, "makes this complicated." She folded her hands in her lap. "You know what complicated looks like in this city," she said. "It's not simpler in a mansion. Marcus was at the wrong place at the wrong time. He doesn't have an advocate. I do what I can. I can ask for help. I can ask for things he needs to learn to move again. I can't make you feel better about the past. I can ask you to make sure you don't keep making it." The directness of her speech, the way she spoke like someone who had practiced setting boundaries, was not news to Bramwell. He had heard demands before, ones that could be answered by money and men. He had not heard one that asked for presence. She wanted changes that mattered, sustained support for Marcus's rehabilitation, an end to practices in neighborhoods that turned people into collateral, and something he had not expected to hear but now needed: his own willingness to be present, to be a parent rather than an overseer. "What precisely do you want?" he asked, and the question was not meant only for clarity. It was a test. She named them plainly, in a sequence that was not theatrical, but thorough. A fund to be set up for Marcus's medical and vocational needs. A commitment from Bramwell's organization to redirect certain activities, de-escalation around residential zones, and an internal assessment that would stop operations from turning neighbors into battlegrounds. Regular visits, not just checks from security, but him, Bramwell, participating in the care plans for Addie, learning to do the things that could not be watched. The last condition she stated quietly: the cameras in the house must be disabled as a symbol and as a practical step toward trust. If he wanted recording for safety, it would be done by professionals with transparent purpose, not the 100 quiet eyes that had watched his family like a museum. There were parts of the list he could not at because he could fund them. There were parts that would require him to change how he saw authority. He looked at each condition as if mapping a territory, and for the first time considered the moral topography he had avoided. The fund would be the easiest. He could set that up in a week if his accountants agreed. The operational reforms would make men in his circle uncomfortable. Changing practices that had been justified as necessary would unsettle the machine he had relied upon. The hardest was the smallest: to unlearn watching and learn being. He weighed the ledger in his head. He was tired of the language of cost. He had been raised to measure loss in numbers because numbers made grief manageable. But numbers could also be used toward repair. He stood, walked around the desk, and looked at Cassidy not as an adversary, but as a negotiator with clear terms. "I will do it," he said finally. "I will set up the fund. I will change the practices we can change. I will meet Marcus. I will try to be present." Cassidy's face did not melt into relief. She was too weary for triumph. "Try is not a currency," she said. "What I need is proof that you will be there next month and next year." He understood the demand. He did not make promises lightly. He put his hands on the desk and spoke like a man who had to reckon with both the public ledger and private consequence. "I'll sign the paperwork today," he said. "I'll meet Marcus within 2 weeks. I'll clear the cameras in the house. Not all at once, but I will start. And I will do it in front of you." She looked at him, measuring whether the words contained the weight of action. Then she nodded once, sharply, like someone who accepted an opening and would hold him accountable to the next step. The cameras went dark in a way Bramwell had not expected. He had imagined the act as symbolic, a drama of power relinquished. Instead, the house felt lighter and raw in the quiet that followed. He had the technicians come and mark the systems for repurposing. Some feeds archived for legal reasons, others unplugged and stored. One by one, the monitors in the security room faded to black. The screens that had been a constellation of angles and ghosted reflections became dead glass. The ambient hum of the monitoring software that had been a lullaby for his anxieties ceased. For the first time in years, he did not know the sound of the house when it was not being watched. The silence was a different sort of exposure. The dismantling was not total. There were still locks on doors and protocols that any father would insist on. But where once 100 eyes had claimed the right to interpret every gesture, there were now only bodies in rooms and the fragile currency of practice, being present. He walked the house without the glow of monitors and felt the difference like cold wind. The playroom was louder because the absence of a camera allowed the noise of a child's life without translation. Bramwell went to meet Marcus in a rehabilitation center that smelled of disinfectant and coffee. The center was deliberately modest. Its halls carried the hum of people rebuilding small tasks. Marcus was there, smaller now, thin in the jaw, his smile cautious. When Bramwell entered the room, the young man looked at him with a wariness he recognized from city streets. A man measuring appearance for threat. Bramwell did not bring an entourage. He walked in with his hands empty, and something about that quiet made the meeting less a negotiation than an awkward attempt at human contact. "I'm Bramwell Rossi," he said, because names had been used as weapons for so long he could not step past the formality. He stopped. He had to navigate a sentence that could neither explain nor absolve. "I'm sorry for what happened to you." Marcus's response was not the furious demand Bramwell expected. Instead, it was a slow, precise accounting. "Sorry doesn't fix a jaw," he said. "It doesn't fix a year of not being able to work. It doesn't pay for the things I need to learn to be useful. Sorry is a word people use while they keep their hands on scales. If you can do things that change what I can do, then I'll listen." Those words cut in ways Bramwell's ledgers could not register. The apology had to be supported by more than emotion. It needed a plan. Bramwell outlined what he would do: funds for rehab and vocational training, a commitment to changing practices that had endangered neighborhoods, and a promise to hire Marcus into a program where he could develop skills without being exploited. Marcus listened, skeptical and patient. At the end of the meeting, he did not reach to shake Bramwell's hand. He did not need to. He agreed to attend therapy sessions paid for by the fund, and he agreed to meet with bankers who would discuss a small stipend that would be his as he trained. The change was neither immediate nor theatrical. Days at the mansion became, over months, a modest revolution of presence. Bramwell learned how to feed Addie without consulting a chart. He learned how to hold her when she woke in the night, not like a man checking a ledger, but like someone answering a sound that required attention. He read the books the therapists recommended. He sat in sessions where Cassidy drew diagrams for him: how to help a child translate intention into motion, how to coax grip without forcing it. He failed often. His hands were clumsy with the tenderness required. But he persisted because Cassidy's list of conditions had been clear: presence, financial accountability, institutional reform. The organization he had built, too, shifted in small administrative ways that had larger moral resonances. He convened a group of his trusted advisors and asked for an audit of neighborhood operations, not to apologize. Apologies were later, but to stop patterns that made residential areas into disputed zones. He instituted a policy that privileged de-escalation and accountability. Men who had previously been encouraged to use heavy-handed tactics found themselves retrained to prioritize safety. He made the moves reluctantly and with imperfect sincerity, but sincerity is a thing that can grow if tended. Cassidy maintained boundaries. She accepted the fund's establishment and the operational changes as pragmatic progress, but refused to let recompense become a clean slate. She asked Bramwell to meet Marcus more than once, to sign documents that guaranteed ongoing support, and to attend particular therapy milestones, appointments that meant he would have to schedule his presence into an order of life that had previously bent around threats and opportunities. Bramwell began to understand that forgiveness was not smoke to be blown from a ledger. It required repeated acts that built trust. He did them, sometimes clumsily, sometimes with the stubbornness that had made him a man of consequence. Addie's improvement was small and incremental. There were months of exercises that yielded nothing visible, and then a day where she grasped a toy by herself, and the room whole seemed to inhale. There were moments where a muscle responded in a way that therapists expected and counted, and moments where a child smiled because a hand had offered a leaf. Progress was not dramatic. It was tidy and patient. Bramwell stopped celebrating what could be measured and learned to find meaning in the unmeasured. Laughter at the dinner table, sticky fingers on a piano key, the way she chose to give a toy to Cassidy like a ceremonial trust. There were relapses too. Marcus had bad days when the world felt brittle and old. Bramwell had bad days when the world felt like a ledger he could not control. They met both in the clinic's small conference room and in the playroom with different kinds of honesty. Bramwell apologized more than once in that first year, sometimes in private notes, sometimes awkwardly in person. Marcus accepted only what he felt he could without losing himself. Cassidy, who had been a bridge between them, navigated both the mania of expectation and the slow weight of restoration. The domestic life of the house changed tone. Rooms became less staged and more lived in. The playroom, once arranged with the precision of a display, bore evidence of a child's ongoing experiments. Paint on a rug, magnetic letters scattered across a table. Bramwell found himself learning to enjoy the disorder. He discovered the pleasure of a sock left in the middle of a floor because it meant someone had been in the house in a way he had not been before. The repurposed surveillance room became a place for making rather than watching. Monitors were removed and replaced by a workbench where Addie could explore textures, a record player that crackled with old music, and painting canvases where Cassidy and Addie planted blobs of color with clumsy, joyous strokes. There were complications in the neighborhood that his reforms could not soothe. Not everything could be repaired by a fund or a policy memo. But there were tangible shifts. Community programs received funding, a vocational school took Marcus's application, and an internal review led to new protocols that kept children and families from being treated like collateral. Bramwell did not become a saint. He became someone who had to live with the fact of his power and the obligation it placed on him. He moved through that reality with a humility that sometimes faltered. Months later, at a small gathering that was neither ostentatious nor minimal, just a few friends and a handful of neighbors, Addie had a milestone. It was not a wedding or a grand ceremony. It was a small moment on a sunlit afternoon when she used a modified walker to cross the width of the garden and stand, wobbling and grinning, holding a paper bird Cassidy had helped her make. The clapping was uneven and affectionate. Bramwell's hands, as he cupped them, were less quick to measure than they had been. They trembled with something like pride. Marcus, who stood at a distance with a cup of coffee, allowed himself a slow smile that was almost shy. He had been part of the work that made this moment possible. Therapy sessions, vocational classes, slow afternoons learning to shape wood in a workshop funded by the new program. Afterward, the group drifted into the repurposed surveillance room, where the old consoles had been turned into a long table. The screens that had once thrown light onto faces now held a vase of daisies and a stack of journals. Bramwell sat with Cassidy and Marcus and Addie at his feet, coloring pencils scattered like confessions. He listened more than he talked. When he did speak, it was quietly. "You were right," he told Cassidy once, the words inadvertently tender. "Being with is different." She nodded. "It is," she said, "and it's hard." The final gesture of change, the narrator could insist, was the turning off of lights and the sealing of a door. But that would be a tidy story. Change did not end with a switch. It continued with meetings, with cancellations, with late-night conversations about how to manage a fund without turning Marcus into a project. It continued with Bramwell learning to ask for help when he could not do the simple tasks required of Addie, and then actually taking the help. It continued with Cassidy guarding the edges of her life so she could give what she had without giving herself away. The neighborhood did not become a fairy tale because a man with resources shifted his tactics. But fewer nights passed where a family lived under direct threat from the organization's activities. There were fewer raids and a new pathway for young people to find skills without being weapons. Marcus found work in a shop that taught him to bend metal into shapes that had nothing to do with territory, benches and lamps and things that would sit in parks instead of fences. He was careful about gratitude. Bramwell was careful about being a patron. Years later, there was a second modest celebration, Addie's small recital, where she tapped a rhythm on a foam cushion and sang the Italian phrase Cassidy had taught her, La Luna Guarda, into a room that had learned to be quiet out of respect. not fear. Bramwell sat in the front row, his face softer than it had been in memory, and he watched his daughter choose, again and again, to reach out and be reached. The cameras were not there. The monitors had become shelves for art supplies. The house hummed with the ordinary noises of life, a kettle, a piano, a laugh that leapt over the table. What was repaired was not whole. There were debts that could not be erased by money, people who needed more than a fund could give, reputations that would never be clean. The organization adapted grudgingly and with fits and starts. Bramwell learned to let others make mistakes when the mistake did not involve a child. He learned to be accountable in ways that made him uncomfortable and that sometimes cost him influence. He learned slowly that power without the willingness to be present was not protection at all. Cassidy stayed. She continued to do the labor of care in the rooms that needed it and the conversations that were hard. She held Marcus's hand at times. She negotiated fiercely when the fund's administrators tried to make decisions without consulting those it was meant to serve. Her life was not simplified by the arrangements. It became steadier. She had a new rhythm. Mornings with Addie, afternoons in the clinic advocating for patients, evenings writing in the notebook she never stopped carrying. She did not forgive like the stories promised. There was no miraculous absolution. She forgave in part, in movement, in the steady reclaiming of what care could do. On a quiet evening years after the photograph first slid from a satchel, Bramwell stood in the room that had once been the heart of his watching. He pressed his palm to the cold glass of a screen no longer in use and felt the imprint of a life he had measured and then unmade. Addie ran by with a paper bird clutched in a sticky small hand. She crashed gently into his knee and laughed, leaving a smear of paint on his trouser leg. He let out a sound that was almost a laugh and almost a prayer. The house was different not because cameras were gone, but because the people in it had learned to ask and to answer the small questions that make a life livable. Bramwell had not been transformed into a saint. He had been remade in the quiet way men are when they are willing to keep at the small, repeatable labor of being present. He had paid for repair, yes, but he had also shown up to do the small, stubborn work that money could not buy. The story that began with a man who hid cameras to protect his paralyzed daughter ended, in one sense, with the cameras turned off. But the deeper arc was this. The diminishment of surveillance had opened a space for trust that demanded to be filled by action. The maid who entered his house with a photograph in her bag had insisted upon care as a right rather than a tool. Her actions, small, exacting, sometimes angry, always human, had forced a reckoning that neither money nor muscle could have achieved alone. If you were moved by this story, leave a comment sharing which moment struck you most, and consider subscribing for more long-form tales about unexpected reckonings and quiet changes.